We are joined by Senior Lecturer of Political Science and Spectator writer, Michael de Percy. Michael, welcome to the show.
Great to be back, Alexandra. Thanks for having me.
It's not often that you come on here and I say, hey, Michael, let's talk about art. But in your recent article, which is titled Art's Gone Woke and No Longer Serves the Common Good, it was inspired by the National Gallery of Australia, which you've cleverly dubbed the National Fringe Gallery of Australia, which I think is far more accurate. The discussion was prompted by the unflattering portrait of Gina Rinehart, which has made headlines for not being a great work of art, but for its aesthetic cruelty. Now, you've wisely asked, what does it do for ordinary Australians? Does it give us hope for a future that is better, fair and more prosperous for the majority? Does it fill the emptiness of existence? End quote. I believe your point is that art should have something to say or at least be a showcase of talent. What do you make of the gallery's decision to host this work?
I think it's important that the gallery maintains its independence, but I think we can also critique its judgment on this particular piece. And as I said, if we look at the National Gallery's program over the next 12 months, almost everything has some sort of a woke agenda. We can't even look at some of the French Impressionist work without looking at it from an anti-colonial perspective. And I just think this has really lost touch with what the purpose of art is, particularly taxpayer-funded art in the Australian context.
Well, I heard that they were going around to some places in libraries and galleries and they were rewriting those little placards that go next to the painting to make sure they give context to some of these works of art. Do you think that is necessary, or is that another example of micromanaging the politics of works of art which were created long before these political movements started?
Absolutely. There's a real revisionist approach to history, and it's really problematic. And even my colleagues who are historians say that it's quite wrong to reapply current sense of morality or senses of morality to the way that we viewed things in the past. And I think, too, that clearly this relabeling of the major works of art, particularly Australian art, where it's been relabeled in a sort of, a decolonising sort of manner where they're, basically poo-pooing the Australian artist and what they stood for at that particular time, instead of seeing it as nation building in a modern nation state context, they're seeing it as being, something that was sort of poor or bad for the country or for certain members of society. And I think this problem is that it's coming from the people who are doing it. It's not coming from the audience or from the artist. It's actually the people who are curating this. Instead of curating, they're now actually editing and adding their own editorials to the works of famous artists. And this is a real problem.
And of course, nobody asked for their opinion. No one wants to know the opinion of critics anyway of artists. They want to look at the artwork itself. Now, you said that you gave up on being a member of the National Gallery because it went woke. Indeed, you added that the wokerati have captured art. It is not organic, it is socialist, which I think is an interesting comment. It's also a bit weird for the whole be kind feminist empowerment left to cheer like clapping seals at a portrait that upsets and victimises a woman whose only crime, as far as I can see, is to be successful in a male-dominated industry, because we all know mining is not exactly the heartland of female employment. So another Spectator writer, Alexander Volz, wrote a piece asking if people should have the right to control what others do with images of their face, for example. You should be able to say no to your likeness hanging in the National Gallery and that sort of thing. Do you agree with that sentiment from Alexander Volz that you should have some kind of say in whether or not your face is hung in a gallery?
I think it's hard with elite people in society because we are a democratic society. We do have this sort of ability to critique the elites, as long as it's not illegal, obviously. And look, I must say that my understanding of the law and of people's images when they've been taken by somebody else, depending on the context, but there have been some major sort of advertising cases where the person and their image was used by a major company and there was nothing that individual could do about it. So I think that that's the way that the law stands at the moment. But look, the thing for me is that we see once again, this is very polarizing. So a curator who's basically polarized art, they've lost me as a member. And I was a faithful member for over 20 years of the National Gallery. I thought it was a very fine institution. And I find at the moment that it's off the rails. It's gone. It's basically a left-leaning organization, and it's only interested in showing things from a left-leaning perspective. And I'm not left-leaning, so I'm not interested in what they have to offer, which leads me to the next point is, why should I have to pay for it?
This is true. I mean, I love art, but I haven't been to the gallery for so long because I know that 80% of it is absolutely worthless. I'd only be going to the same small section that I always used to go to. But you make the point that before the modern era of art, where, art can be comparable to literal trash, you can't tell the difference, much of the art world was funded by patrons. You had the royals, the wealthy merchant families. Look at the Medicis in Italy. When they spent their money, they wanted to ensure that they were immortalising things like beauty, power and talent, which they hung on their walls as a display of wealth, in the same way that the Maharajas dripped with jewels, they displayed beautiful images. Now, people can bicker over the merits of the rich driving art, but at the end of the day, Michael, their influence gave us some of the greatest artistic revolutions in history, and art so extraordinary that we still travel halfway around the world to stare at it in galleries. But now we've got the government funding art and politics funding art, and maybe it's democratic, but Michael, is it better?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, we have to accept that some of the biggest egos in history have produced some of the most amazing series of artworks and architecture and other things. Without these egos and their wealth and power, we wouldn't have these things. And that does give us a sense of awe when we look at them. And look at the Harbour Bridge, for example, and the whole Bradford story around that, the competing egos over the Opera House. So we have these things, but at the moment it's completely dominated by one side. This is not about toing and froing between challenging battle of ideas in the art world, but it's in effect it's being sort of editorialized and curated to give a particular political message. And at the moment, as I said, if you look at the gallery's program in the coming year, they've basically taken things that were anti-establishment and they've re-established them as an establishment piece to sort of speak to us in an establishment way. And I think that this is the major problem. It's not coming from the artists; it's coming from the curators. And I think that they've really overstepped their role in that regard.
Well, the capitalist world of art, where artists were competing on merit for a customer, that produced greatness for the same reason that the rest of the economy works. Competition underpinned by a customer who wants value tends to lead to good products. But the government doesn't care about value, it's interested in box ticking. Indeed, politics has a habit of destroying art. I mean, you mentioned the Temple of Baal in Palmyra. Are we steadily losing the great works of art and architecture, Michael? Because we're not really replacing them with much, new stuff.
It's interesting because I went to the Pudong Art Museum and looked at the Mona Lisa from Prado, because there's actually more than one version of the Mona Lisa. And it was quite interesting because China's policy toward art is about seeing it as a way to capture their pride from their history and to establish a sense of national identity. Whereas the Australian approach to art is to completely undo our sense of national identity in some sort of post-colonial idea that, it doesn't serve the common good. It's basically saying, that we should hate ourselves, we should hate our past, we shouldn't have pride in our future, and we're going to use art to reconfirm that in an editorialized way. And to me, it's really problematic that, we have to travel overseas to see great works of art in the context that the artist provided them in. And that editorialised content that we're seeing in Australia, it's a really bad habit, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed. But look, the only real way to address this is in a democratic way, and that's to stop paying for it and to stop going to see it.
Well, you know what they say about culture, if you lay down, you'll be walked over. But while the government forks out hundreds of millions of dollars for art that is indistinguishable from garbage, we're never going to have a renaissance in Australia. There've always been artistic movements manifesting around the edges of politics. I mean, you mentioned the French Impressionists and Dadaism, and you mentioned also some others in your article. But that kind of revolutionary art is different to propaganda of the state or artwork that exists as the flattery of modern politics. And you brilliantly said, while many people dislike things like Dada, at least they had a point. And I'm struggling to find a point in many of today's artistic endeavours. I mean, anyone can paint a bad and unflattering portrait of somebody, and anyone can submit an entirely blue canvas to a gallery. These things do not display a supernatural or incomprehensible level of skill that is elevated to wonder, like the Sistine Chapel, that makes you ponder how on earth did humans make these things? Or I don't know if you listen to Pavarotti's voice, it sends shivers across your spine, even if you know nothing else about him. So, Michael, is there a point, in your opinion, to modern art, or is this just a taxpayer grift?
Well, look, I'm really concerned about grifting. It's interesting. I looked up the origins of the word, and I understand it's an American slang term for swindling. And in many ways, this is one of the problems where the state starts funding things where they pick winners. Basically, they start providing the inputs, and people use the inputs to create whatever, as opposed to seeking out inputs that serve a particular outcome. And look, the thing is too that even propaganda art, some propaganda art is absolutely fantastic. It's I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with the message of the propagandists, but the point is that it serves some sense of a common good or some sense of national identity or, promotion of a particular idea. And unfortunately, in Australia, we're not promoting an idea. We're trying to actually dismantle an idea. And I think that negative territory is just, it's abysmal. It doesn't make any sense. Like, where does this lead to is my question. And I asked this in a previous article where I looked at decolonization as a way of undoing the Enlightenment, but it was enabled by the Enlightenment thinking in the first place. So it sort of doesn't really lead anywhere is the problem. And I'd really like to see something around the curators more focused on presenting the art to us as opposed to incorporating it into a political narrative that suits this decolonization myth that we're dealing with at the moment.
Well, there's an awful lot of money washing around in this industry of modern art. I think you and me, Michael, our next project should be to take over the modern art world. We can submit blank canvases or throw paint at them and become multimillionaires almost overnight. That should be enough to get us there. And a few anti-Western hashtags, that'd seal the deal. But unfortunately, that's all we've got time for here today on Spectator TV. Thank you for joining us.
That's great. Thanks. Really glad to be back.